Now, I think we need to pivot a little bit. We've been talking to the parents the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
What about the kids? Does the Bible have anything to say to them?
Absolutely.
It sure does. Now, I don't know what the age demographic of our listeners exactly is. I know that the majority of them, at least, are not kids. But hey,
This would be a good time to gather the kids together.
that's what I was going to say. Exodus 20:12. This is from the good old 10 Commandments. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. This is affirmed in the New Testament, Ephesians 6:1-3. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. It then quotes, honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. And then once again in Colossians 3, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord.
Yeah, and I would just say, it says there that you may live long in the land. To me, that speaks to the cultural issue that we talked about before. Obedient children and parents that demand and deserve obedience create a culture that allows a society to prosper over the long term. That is the building block that makes that happen. That is the promise that is given in that scripture. Now, specifically to kids, it is in learning to obey your parents that you learn to obey God, because your parents are going to tell you things that you don't understand. You don't know why they're saying that you should do this. You're just not there yet. It requires a trust on your part, a faith that they have your best interest at heart. And when you do that and it follows through, you learn that indeed those things were true. It is no different than following and being obedient to God, because God's ways are higher than our ways. The things that he tells us to do, we're not always going to understand. And it requires faith and trust on our part that he has our best interest at heart, that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purposes, that that good outcomes will happen from us being obedient to God. That's what's being taught there. And to the kids, I would say, your life will be better. The boundaries that your parents are establishing for you are there to not hold you back, but to give you the foundation upon which to truly bloom and grow and be successful. Since we've been stuck on business analogies, I would just say, do you want to be the CEO of the company, or do you want to be on the lowest tier of the organizational structure? Well, what your parents are trying to do is to train you up in a way that allows you to climb that ladder to the executive position in actual real life of raising your own family and being a productive adult. If obedience is not demanded, if obedience is not provided by the kids, you're kind of relegating yourself to the lower rungs of the organizational structure. You're setting yourself up to be an unsuccessful adult.
Yeah, and then the question is, should I obey my parents if they're flawed people? And of course, all of them are. This is the same issue with a wife submitting to her husband. The claim is, how can I submit to someone who is sinful? And I'll say the same thing now that I said then. Insofar as the parents are imitating Christ, then the obedience to the parents will be the same as your obedience to Christ, who is perfect. It's just a further imperative to live your life in the model that has been given us.
Yeah, let me just say, too, one thing that we learn as a child under the authority of parents is that authority is a good thing when it has our best interest at heart. There is a big move in our culture to rebel against all authority. That's not healthy for a culture. It's not healthy for a family. And so part of that family arrangement and what your role as a child in that family is learning to submit to authority, learning to suppress your own will for the betterment of everyone.
Right.
Sometimes as a member of the family, you don't get your way. And it's not because your way is a bad way. It's just that it's somebody else's turn to have their way, and so it's learning to lay down our own desires for the betterment of others.
Yeah, husbands and parents are not the only bodies of authority that we're called to submit to. We're also called to submit to the governing authorities, and we know how problematic those can be. And yet God has commanded that we do that, Don't be thinking that you are so much wiser than those that God has placed in authority over you. We live in a very progressive society that likes to cast things off without having the wisdom to understand why they're there in the first place. That's what your parents have. And to a degree, that's what the governing authorities have. And I've pulled up this verse from Proverbs. It's a verse that I love. I remember the first time I read it recently, it just seemed like it's such a fitting verse for what's happening in our culture today. Do not move the ancient landmark that your fathers have set. There's plenty of that going on today. And what's the issue with that? Are all of our landmarks good and right and as they should be? Of course not. But there's something there that we do not yet understand. And we need to respect our ignorance. We need to be humble, and we need to have faith in the things that God has told us to honor. Speaking of honor, it's not just obedience that is commanded in that phrase, honor your father and your mother. It's true. It's honor as such. It's respect, reverence. I want to read you a few verses about that. Genesis 9, 20 through 27 is the first story in which this is really seen. Here we have Noah and his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We won't read the whole story right now, but I would encourage you to read it for yourself, verses 20 through 27. What we see there is the juxtaposition between Ham, who dishonored his father Noah, and Shem and Japheth, who honored their father Noah in their actions. And what was the result of that? Ham became the servant of Shem and Japheth. In Proverbs 20:20, it says, if one curses his father or his mother, his lamp will be put out in utter darkness. And this is just one of many verses that have to do with cursing your father and your mother. It is not dealt with lightly in the Bible, that transgression. Proverbs 30:17, the eye that mocks a father and scorns to obey a mother will be picked out by the ravens of the valley and eaten by the vultures. Kids, are you scared yet? You should be. This is no small matter.
Yeah.
John MacArthur points out that parents are one of the things that God has established to uphold the morality of a society. If we do not honor our parents, if we do not obey them, then we will fall apart. We will become an undisciplined, unruly, unfaithful people.
Yeah, let me just say, too, that honoring our parents does not end when we leave their household. That's a lifelong endeavor. And I would say, especially as our parents begin to age, how we honor and respect them as they age, not only shows them great respect and honor, but it models for our kids how they should treat us. All right. So, I have aging parents now, and Jonna has her mother is still here, and I know she's going to listen to this podcast. She's one of our great fans. She's not elderly yet,
Right?
Not yet. But she is creeping that direction. How we interact with her and honor her says a lot to you as our children about how I would like for you to treat myself.
Right.
And, when we get older, and we're going to do a segment on this, aging later down the road and how to live out the word in that. But the truth is when we get older, we lose some of our cognitive abilities. Our memory begins to go on us. We get forgetful about things. Maybe our decision making is not as sharp as it used to be. That's just the natural order of things. And so that doesn't mean that we don't still respect and honor them. How we serve, other people, parents and people of all ages, oftentimes if we think we're smarter than somebody or we think we're a better decision maker, we tend to look down on those other people. But we need to value them in the same way that we value ourselves. That's humility. Recognizing that though that person may not have a cognitive ability that I have or a skill that I have, they're equally valuable to God.
Yeah.
That's humility.
Yeah. Helping your parents maintain their dignity as they age. Dignity is another thing that our society doesn't understand very well. Referring back to that story in Genesis 9 about Noah and his sons, Ham found Noah in a vulnerable position, and he exploited that, whereas Shem and Japheth preserved their father's dignity. As your parents age, they're going to become more vulnerable, and their dignity is going to become more fragile. It is your role as a child to help them maintain their dignity to the end of their life.
Absolutely. And that's, as I already said, that's a model for how your kids are going to treat you down the road.